Okay. Cool. Coding in progress. Well, thanks a lot for coming to have a look at this talk on deadtrees.earth and specifically the technical behind the scenes, how we want to build a global map of fractional tree mortality and tree cover using remote sensing, specifically Sentinel-1 and 2. So my slides are not going. Okay, now they go. So this whole project started when we were trying to, like everyone, figure out, wanted to get a better understanding why trees die where. And when you look at existing global studies of trying to understand the drivers of tree mortality at a global scale, you'll see mostly these two studies and also a couple of others. But the main aspect of these is that they are based on sites, like a couple of hundred sites that are spread globally. And these sites are very small, meaning the results that are based on these studies will be biased in some way. And just extrapolating from this fraction of a percent of forest area to global forest cannot be accurate. But this is the best data that we have at the time. But this also means that there's a huge research gap because we lack globally, spatially, and temporally continuous map on tree mortality. And this is what we want to build. So when you think about tree mortality at a global scale and mapping that, you maybe first think about Global Forest Watch. And Global Forest Watch is a product that has been there for the past 10 or 15 years now, who map forest loss instead of tree mortality, which is very different, at a global scale based on Landsat. For example, to demonstrate why this product isn't enough, I've selected this spot in Spain. So on the left, you have a drone photo that I took back 2 years ago, where about half the trees are actually dead. On the right, you have the Global Forest Watch product, so the forest loss product. And you can see that there's absolutely no signal. The shading in the background is just the terrain. And this is because tree loss is just not mortality. Trees can be lost for various reasons, not only mortality. They can be lost because they are harvested, because they're windthrows, because they're selective logging. There are many factors that introduce forest loss. But to understand tree mortality, which is when trees die because of, for example, droughts or pathogens or diseases, or these kinds, we need a product that explicitly links to tree mortality, not just forest loss. And we actually also want to go one step further. And we not only want to figure out these large-scale events, but we also want to find scattered tree death. For example, in this study in California from 2024, they have shown that tree mortality was underestimated because they didn't consider scattered tree death. And this is a really important finding. And this also means that we really don't know how much scattered tree death is impacting tree mortality at a global scale. Maybe scattered tree death is the main, is the cause of mortality. This is the mortality type that we should be looking at, and not just large scale events. We don't know. But to figure that out, we have to map tree mortality at a global scale first.
Clemens, I think your slides might be stuck. We're still seeing slide 2.
Oh, really? Oh, no. Is it working now?
I still see just slide 2 right now.
What do you, okay. I'll share again.
I see it skipped forward to slide 5, but I do see you full screen controlling the mouse. There we go.
Are you seeing the scattered mortality slide now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so here's the study on scattered mortality. I'm sorry. And on the right, you have a plot near where I work in Leipzig, where you have scattered mortality, and this is not shown on products that are currently out there. So now you see slide 7. Hello, do you see slide 7?
Yes.
Okay,
I do.
thanks. So when you want to map global tree mortality, the most obvious sensor is Sentinel-2, because here we have a spatial resolution of 10 meters. It captures the whole world at global scale and also temporally continuous at like 5 to 10 days on average. The issue is when you look at Sentinel-2, and you want to create some form of training labels to then create a deep learning model, for example, to map tree mortality, you really have an issue figuring out what actually dead trees are in Sentinel-2 imagery. So when this is this exact same spot again in Spain, one time in Sentinel-2 RGB composite and one time in drone RGB imagery, and you can really see that it's incredibly hard to figure out what's going on with Sentinel-2 imagery. But this drone imagery gives a clue of what we're going to do next, because we're going to use drone images as reference to then create training labels from Sentinel-2 data for Sentinel-2 data. And because we believe in this mission of using high-resolution drone data as reference for training global models, we have built this global database. It's called deadtrees.earth. It's a collection of drone auto photos at global scale that are all mostly at 10 centimeters or better in resolution. This database currently encompasses about 3,000, almost 3,000 drone auto photos, and it's growing every single day, especially since now our platform, so the deadtrees.earth is also a website, not just a project. Because on the website, you can upload imagery, and since 1 month or 2 months, this upload actually works and people can contribute. For example, yesterday, someone uploaded 112 auto photos just from South Africa, which was amazing to see. So if you have drone auto photos, please upload them there. This is a public database. Everyone will be able to download the data, basically as a service for the community. Yeah, if you like dead trees, which is why you're probably in this talk, here are some images of how dead trees look in different countries in the world, which again underlines why we need this global database, because dead trees look very different in different biomes, at different elevation, different latitudes, and also tree species in their format look very different. It's not just a green blur. So we really need a comprehensive reference data set like this database to build, to make good conclusions about the state of mortality at global scale. So how exactly are we going to use these drone auto photos as reference to create training labels for Sentinel-2? Well, first, we started manually labeling dead trees, but now we already have a working model that can handle any drone auto photo in the world and can label dead trees automatically. So here on the left, you have a prediction of how dead trees, of the labeled dead trees in this drone auto photo. And there's a paper on that that's currently in view, but it's already out as a preprint on Tech Archive if you want to look at that. And what's special about this paper is that it doesn't only just, it's not just, we didn't just slap auto photos and labels onto this model, but we also built it in such a way that it can handle multiple resolutions. So when you put in 1 centimeter drone auto photos or 28 centimeter drone auto photos, it's able to handle that. And depending on the resolution, the spatial context changes, and it's able to take advantage of this trade-off between resolution and spatial context. Here's some examples of how the model performs in completely unseen auto photos that it has never seen before, and they were also not labeled before. On the left, you have some mortality in Western Australia, and on the right, some in Andalusia in Spain. In the middle, some in Poland, and that's a really important detail, and that is that it doesn't only label fully dead trees, but it labels partial dieback as well. Because when you look at a forest from above, it's really hard to differentiate which branch belongs to which tree. So we built the model in a way that just labels dead branches. It doesn't care whether the entire tree is dead or just a couple of branches. And this is important because what a couple of studies have shown is that when you have partial dieback in 1 year, a couple of years later, the tree is usually dead. So it can also act as an early warning signal.
Clemens, I'm so sorry to interrupt once again. The taskbar for Zoom is obscuring the top of the slides.
Okay, sorry. But you can
And no
see
worries.
slide 18 now, right?
I can.
Okay. Cool.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, here have some examples of how this model performs in a very difficult context. On the left, there's I don't know what exactly this tree species is, but it looks it looks dead because it's really white. But the model is able to figure out that this is not a dead tree, but just a differently colored tree species. On the right, you have results of the model mapping in a very difficult context where the background is just rocks, and a very extremely bright forest photo is super similar to dead trees in terms of color, but crucially the structure is different, and the model would only be able to figure out this at a very high resolution. Then what we also do, because not only mapping dead trees is interesting, but also forests in general, because when you map forests and dead trees at the same time, you know how much forest is actually there, and then you can figure out how much of the forest is dead. So on our autophoto database, we not only apply our dead tree segmentation model, but we also apply the restore tree count delineation model, which basically creates a binary mask of forest and non-forests. And when we have these labels, we overlay the Sentinel grid, because the whole motivation is to create labels for that Sentinel resolution. So we overlay the Sentinel grid, and then for each Sentinel pixel, we compute the fractional cover of standing deadwood and tree cover. It means 100%. 100% means that entire pixel is covered in deadwood or trees, and like 50% means that maybe half a crown is in this pixel instead. So we apply these models to our global autophoto database, and this means we now have a globally distributed training data set with about 3.1 million labeled pixels everywhere in the world. So this is fantastic training and validation data to create a model that hopefully works at global scale to detect dead trees and forests. And we also need the Sentinel data to train on and to do our predictions on. And the issue with Sentinel data, it's not an issue, it's just the way that it's available, is that it's in the Sentinel tiling grid. So it's tiled, and each of the tiles somehow overlap, and they're rotated to each other, and they're different coordinate systems. So we need to somehow merge them, reproject them to create a homogeneous data cube. And this homogeneous data cube also needs to be in a coordinate reference system, in a global one, ideally. And we also want to remove clouds and snow, because clouds and snow don't tell us anything about tree mortality, and the model could get confused. For this, we have built a Python package just called Sentinel. It's on GitHub. Why is there no link? Well, if you Google Sentinel, you will find it on GitHub. And it's a Python tool which fully automatically generates Sentinel-1 and 2 data cubes at global scale, and handle theoretically infinite sizes, because it pulls the data from the entire computer and then at the same time processes them and puts them on the hard drive. So it just does each through the requested data cube, spatial and temporal context. It also has temporal aggregation and in-memory cloud and snow detection. So how does this Python package work in detail? So the user is requesting a time range, in this case between 2017 and 2025, which is basically all Sentinel data that is available. The user also supplies bounds, so left, right, top, and bottom of the data cube, and target coordinate reference system in which the data is supposed to be reprojected, and then also an aggregation range, because when you don't get an entire picture of the entire Earth in like one go, because the cell flies around the Earth. So you have to do some aggregation to get homogeneous time steps in your data cube. This package takes these parameters and then subdivides this into so-called processing tiles, which have a spatial extent and a temporal extent of just one aggregated temporal time step. And this is then in each worker process, because the package is parallelized. Each worker process subdivides again these processing tiles into smaller chunks and just eats through them. So they are pulled from the planetary computer data repository, and then they are put through a harmonization process, a cloud detection process, which is implemented in a separate worker process that does it on a GPU, also a snow detection, and then finally it reprojects the small subtiles into a processing tile, which is then saved automatically into a SAS storage. I'll weather through this very quickly because there's a lot of technical details that don't matter for remote sensing, but the important part about this package is that it's scalable, it does everything for you, and it's scalable because we need it to be scalable because at the end we want to build a global map of tree mortality based on Sentinel-1 and 2, and there was no such package out there. So now we have we apply this tool on all the sites where we have our drone auto photos. So now we have our training data, so our training labels, and we have our Sentinel-1 and 2 time series in a data cube format. So how exactly do we build a model that maps tree mortality and forest cover from Sentinel-1 and 2 data? Well, if you have one of the important parts of the model is that it doesn't just take an image, Sentinel-1 and 2, and does a prediction, but it takes a lot of temporal context. In fact, it takes the entire 8 years of temporal context that is available for Sentinel-1 and 2 to make the best possible prediction of tree mortality and forest cover. So you have a time series of data cubes. All these data cubes have some spatial context, spectral context, and then the entire time series has obviously temporal context at a resolution of 7 days. And the time series is 416 steps long, which means 8 years. All of these individual data cubes are then.
So sorry to interrupt again. I think your slides might be stuck. Sorry.
Oh man. What slide
right now
on?
we're seeing 27, and now we're on 29. Okay, it just like.
Okay, that is so strange. I'm
there
sorry.
we go. Okay, now it seems like it's being really responsive. So I'm not entirely sure what's driving that. I'm so sorry to keep interrupting you, but I think we're good now.
Okay, so please keep interrupting me if it doesn't go forward when it should.
Sure.
So this time series of data cubes is that fed into I'll put a very fancy term there. It's a spatial temporal spectral feature extraction encoder. What it's actually doing is taking each of these spatial and spectral cubes, apply some flattening, then a simple linear expansion to a longer vector. And this vector of length 512, that time series of that is fed into a transformer encoder. And this transformer encoder then extracts all the necessary spatial, spectral, and temporal features that are hopefully necessary to map tree mortality accurately. And then at the end, you have we concatenate a max pooling, a mean pooling, and a linear layer to then get a long vector of length 1568, which basically sums up all the data of this time series. And we also add to this vector another vector of 32 constants that are aspect, slope, work, Clemens Mosig grids to give the model an understanding of roughly where it is in the world and what kind of climate it is in, so how it has to interpret the time series. This is then fed through a linear layer, and at the end you get two values that are deadwood cover and forest cover. Please interrupt me if you're not on slide 32. And this deadwood and forest cover is for the center pixel of the spatial context for the beginning of the time series. And this is really important because this means we need to have this time series start somewhere in the growing season, because if it would let it start in winter, the model would see at the end of the time series that there are no leaves on the trees, meaning it would potentially predict trees as dead, even though they're just deciduous. So this means we need to figure out when we let the time series start for every single pixel on Earth, which is difficult because the phenology, so the seasons, vary depending on the location on Earth. For this, we are using I haven't put the source in, but it's a modus-derived product, a modus-derived phenology product. It's technically at 500-meter resolution, but it's a bit inconsistent spatially and temporally. So aggregated it to 40 kilometers and 1 timestamp, get a probability distribution of when the growing season is and when it isn't. So here you have the probability distribution of the growing season for a forest in South Africa, meaning you have the peak season roughly in New Year's. And based on this distribution, we infer an inference state where we let the time series start that we give to the model, because the model is supposed to predict fractional mortality and fractional forest cover at the beginning of the time series that it receives. This is how this peak season phenology map looks like at a global scale. So at the top of Europe, which is where you have the peak season roughly in June. At the bottom, you have the southern globe where the peak season is roughly in January or December. In terms of data augmentation, we are applying random flips and rotations to the Sentinel patches of the spatial context. We're adding noise to the Sentinel data of up to 4%. Here, adding relative amount is important because the amount of noise that Sentinel data has increases with the strength of the signal. So it's relative. We also add noise to the labels of up to 15, so 15% in terms of deadwood or forest cover. And this is because, like you've seen in the beginning, that our training labels should technically be perfect because they're derived from autophotos and the segmentation models are really good. But the fact that I haven't said is that like, these autophotos are not necessarily perfectly georeferenced, and also the Sentinel data is not perfectly georeferenced. So you always have a shift, and the training data isn't necessarily perfect for a pixel by pixel inference. So we're adding a lot of noise. So 15 is, at least by my measure, a lot of noise for a label between 0 and 1. We also remove 20% of the time steps, and we do some random cropping of the time series between 52 and 416 weeks, so between 1 and 8 years, so that the model learns to work with any kind of temporal context. Because when we want to have a mortality prediction 2017, then the model can only get a maximum of 1 year of temporal context. Whereas when we want to do a mortality prediction 2024, then the model is supposed to take advantage of the entire time series that is available. Our sampling strategy is also quite simple. We started off with a sampling strategy that was super strict because our data set is crowdsourced, and we thought, well, we need to find each. I hope I'm on slide 37, by the way.
Still seeing 36.
Oh man, now 37.
We're still on 36. It seems like, I don't know.
There
we go. Now we're on 37.
Okay. It's so strange. So in terms of sampling strategy, we first thought, because our data set is crowdsourced, but that we have so many biases in many dimensions. And therefore, in the first iteration, when we built this model, we identified all the biases that we could and tried to apply over and under sampling. But this actually, like, we're working on this for a very long time, but this actually introduced another bias in another dimension. And then we try to correct that, and again, introduce biases. So even though, and then in the end, we came actually to this very simple sampling strategy of just splitting the data into 3 groups of no deadwood, a little deadwood, and a lot of deadwood, and applying some very simple spatial caps. So a maximum number of pixels per autophoto and spatial block. And this sampling strategy, even though it is so relaxed, worked the best, even though the data set is biased and like heavily towards certain regions in Western Europe and some regions in the US and in Spain. So the model is able to just figure out what it needs to learn, apparently. So hope I'm showing slide 38 now. Here's some example predictions of how this,
now 38.
Okay, cool. So here's some example predictions of how the model is performing. On the left, you have the drone auto photo, from which we derive the training labels. And in the middle, you have these training labels that we derived automatically with the segmentation models from the drone auto photo. On the right, you have the prediction just from Sentinel-1 and 2. And this is in the validation set, meaning the model has never seen this site in the training, this entire site. And you can see the model is working quite well. It's identifying these deadwood mortality sites and also figures out that there's where there's forest, and even figures out there are some like 3 or 4 trees in the open. So these. Here you have a site in Spain, in southern Spain, Andalusia. One of the sites that I showed earlier where Global Forest Watch didn't have a signal. And you can see that the mortality pattern is matching quite well. And also, crucially, that this more open canopy forest is mapped really, really well, because it's not 100%. It's not like the model doesn't predict 100% forest, but it's more predict like 50 or 30% forest, which is correct. There's an example in a deciduous forest, the largest deciduous forest in Europe, I think, in Hainich, where I was able to identify these 2 major, I would say, mortality spots of 3 trees that have died. And then it hasn't identified all the individual mortality, but it's starting to get, like, these 2 are somewhat correct. This one is incorrect, hasn't identified these, but we're working on making them a little better, but I'm not sure if we'll ever be able to detect one small dead tree in a forest that has died from Sentinel-1 or 2, because in the end, it's just 10-meter resolution. Here's another example from southern Spain, where this gradient of open canopy forest is mapped really nice. And also the forest road has been detected, and this open canopy forest here at the top. Yeah, more and more eye candy. Again, some mortality that has been missed up here. So since our model is, I hope you can see slide 43 now. So our model is it's a time series model in the end, so we can do predictions for every single year. And here you have a fantastic spot in Germany where we have this, we have multiple huge disturbances multiple years in a row, which is horrible for the forest and the environment, but great for us because now we can study this in detail. So in 2019, after the 2018 drought, now we have a huge mortality event. So down here is the deadwood cover time series, and at the top is the forest cover time series. So we had a huge mortality event. And then over the course of 2020 and 2021, you see some tree mortality decay. Actually, sorry, in the bottom right, you can see how this forest looks in the drone auto photo. So it's really entirely dead. And then at the end in 2022, there was, funny enough, funny for us at least, a fire just eliminating the forest that has died entirely, which is very nicely visible on the forest cover map because the forest is now entirely removed. So this brings me to the end of my talk. We have a prototype model that is working in a lot of regions, and we're improving it as we speak. But before we create a global map, we want to get user experience in and see if it's working at sites where users want to apply the model. So if you have sites of interest that are not that large, maybe 30 by 30 kilometers, where we should apply our model, then we're happy to send you the data. And then you can report back how well the model is performing for you. Finally, here's some publications. They're not published yet. They're just under review. and the third one is in prep. So there's the first publication is on the database itself, and the other one is on mapping the multi-scale mapping of standing deadwood and drawn auto photos. And the third one is what I've just showed, so the mapping of standing deadwood in Sentinel-1 and 2 time series. I hope I'm still online, and this was my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you. There we go. We just got to your publication list. I wanted to make sure that you get due credit for that. Well, I have so many questions. This was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for this. But I also want to open it up to the audience if anyone else has any questions. All right, well, while people are thinking of some, one question I have is when you discuss the architecture for your network that is doing like the proportion of standing deadwood, like that portion of your workflow, I'm actually really surprised that you took the approach of taking the input tensor and flattening it before going into the encoder. I'm surprised that that's not like removing the spatial context or the temporal context that's like a convolutional or a recurrent architecture might be able to pick up on. So I'm just curious your thoughts on like why do you think that approach worked?
Yeah, so we actually started with, can you see the slide 32 with the architecture?
Yeah.
Okay, so this spatial context is much smaller than you think. It's just we're experimented with no spatial context, 3x3 and 5x5. And there we actually started with a convolutional kernel in spectral dimension and spatial dimension instead of the flattening. This produced fine results, but when you apply convolution kernel, you assume that neighboring pixels are closely related, and this neighboring items are closely related. This may be the case for the spatial context, but not necessarily for the spectral context. In Sentinel-2, yes, but since we also use Sentinel-1, the Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2 asset may not be related. So instead, we just flattened it and put a linear layer on it, because in the end, a linear layer is more powerful than a convolutional approach. And a convolutional approach is just making it more efficient. But since the spatial context is so small, just 3x3 or 5x5, the flattening doesn't actually make the vector so large. That's the explanation.
Makes sense. Thank you.
We also made some ablation studies trying to figure out how much spatial context we actually need. And I found no visible improvement between 1 and 5 pixels of spatial context. So we are thinking of just removing it entirely.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. I guess something else that came to mind is most of these ortho photos you're looking at, like it's just RGB, right? Like you don't have a near IR band.
Yep.
Or anything. Yeah. So I guess like that also like really surprises me then that it's able to not commit a false positive on the light colored tree species. Do you think that's just like the shape of that species is different and like that's where it's coming from? I suppose that this is a different like part of your workflow when you're trying to delineate the dead trees from ortho photos.
Yeah. So when you look at, I don't know, have this slide. Yeah. The hidden slide. The reason for this is the spatial resolution. So when you look at drawn auto photos in RGB, it's extremely crucial to have them below 10 centimeters and ideally at about 5 centimeters, because in the paper in the database paper there's a comparison, like a visual comparison, and when you go like to 20 centimeters or like below that, you cannot, even with your own eyes, you cannot differentiate between rocks and dead trees. So you really need this like 10 centimeter or 5 centimeter resolution to figure out the structural patterns of the dead tree, of the tree. And then at that resolution, a bright tree will also be substantially different than a dead tree, and the model has learned that.
Thank you. All right, I don't want to dominate the Q&A too much. Surely someone else has something to throw out.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a follow-up on that as well. That flattening also really interested me. I've known of, so personally, my background is meteorology, specifically with radar meteorology. And I found that really interesting with that flattening rather than the convolutional neural network. I've had some projects in the past where what I did was I trained these 500 millibar geopotential height maps. What I ran into more of a situation where there was less overfitting because of those relations between those contours, like you mentioned. So I'm wondering what that assumption about convolutional neural networks and having pixels related to each other means for other interdisciplinary studies. Because obviously it makes sense for a convolutional neural network with image deep learning. If you're training images of dogs or cats, they'll have these attributes. But when it comes to trees or a similar discipline where, let's say, there's these clusters of dead trees and there's lots of amounts of biodiversity and all these sorts of different species. Were you able to pick up some of those differences, or was it able to kind of detect trees as they were dying based on their species, or were you able to extrapolate more information from that? Because I know there's lots of different underlying variables with this sort of stuff. Although that's my assumption. I'm not studying this field.
Yeah. So what's important is that this model is only for the Sentinel data, and the model that does the tree segmentation and drawn order photos, that is a convolutional network. Because in drawn order photos, you really need the spatial context and the relationships between the neighboring pixels because there's a lot of structure in the images. But at Sentinel, because we work at 10-meter resolution, maybe I go back to slide 20. Yeah, so at 10-meter resolution, you don't have there's usually just one tree in the pixel or more than one tree. So when you go beyond this pixel to maybe the neighboring pixel, it doesn't give you structural information about the tree or the species, but it just gives you information about the next tree, the tree next to the dead tree. So that's at least my explanation for why spatial context here doesn't matter, and also the convolution on flattening doesn't make any difference, because 10 meters is already so large that only what's in this 10-meter pixel is relevant, and everything around that it's just it's not information that is relevant for the prediction. Does it make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess also, just as some background for myself, in that photo on the left, what would cause those sorts of trees to die in those small clusters like that? Is that just part of how those trees operate? You can tell my ignorance with this sort of stuff.
Well, I would know why trees die. I wouldn't do this project. I'd say this question is beyond what I know, because I'm a computer scientist that went into this field, and I try to do the mapping as best as I can. So I don't know why these trees died specifically, but we had a study just this year or last year where they figured out the best possible, like the highest correlations between tree mortality and environmental variables for Germany. So they did this approach of mapping fractional cover for the whole of Germany across many years. And what they found is that the best predictor for tree mortality was late frost. So late frost. So when the temperature goes up, and then there's some leaf budding, So the leaves come out, but then they freeze again. And this made the trees apparently die, or maybe this was just the best correlation in the majority of cases. But that's just a correlation, not necessarily the reason.
Yeah, and I guess kind of along those lines, was there a limit to the months of the year that these ortho photos were taken to avoid? I mean, obviously you can't tell a dead tree in the winter since they all kind of look the same without their leaves.
Yeah.
I assuming that it's a certain type of tree where that happens rather than like a pine tree or something.
Yeah. So we did filter the order photos, and in non-tropical biomes, we filtered the order photos manually. First base, we removed all the order photos that were in winter based on the phenology. But then we also went through the order photos to really remove any deciduous trees that have lost their leaves, still don't have leaves in April or May. Sometimes we included images from the winter if it was just evergreen trees, just to increase the training data. And then the tropics, it's really difficult to figure out a season because it depends heavily on the location. And there we relied again on this phenology product, and we only included order photos that were roughly in this growing season, so where leafless trees ideally correspond to dead trees.
Cool, thank you. I guess my one other question, and this is something we always try to do, is have a bit of a takeaway for users after this, and it looks like you've got that here with the deadtrees.earth website to submit a photo. Is there any sort of tips or takeaways that you might have for anyone who's interested in contributing to this? Maybe is there a particular data set or a drone usage for some of those things?
Yeah, so essentially, if you have any kind of drone auto photos of forests that are better than 10 centimeter in resolution, then, and also need the timestamp, so the acquisition date of the drone auto photo, then just upload them to the website. This is also the how to say it? The data it's not just available to us, it's available to the entire community. So everyone can benefit from your data if you upload it. And this also means that your data, if you use this for a study, is not only in some Zenodo repository that no one ever finds again, but it's on an interactive website where people can find your data and then potentially cite you, because we also link the studies from where the auto photos are.
That's fantastic. And I see there on the platform, there's a drone option, an airborne option, or a satellite option, and various other things. That's awesome. Yeah, increasing that searchability of this. It's great. I think that's all I have for my questions. I think for the other attendees, I see it's just down to 5, including us. If anybody else doesn't have any questions, then I think we can go ahead and conclude for today. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot. And
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to our next webinar that's going to be next month. And with that being said, I'll give you back the last 15 minutes of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you. See you.
Thanks, Clemens.